Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'll try not to talk muffled. These things are muffled.
Did you make the mask yourself?
I did.
That's cute.
Oh,
I heard from like one of the teachers that were at Hillside. He was telling like one of my teacher that you made him a mask because his ears were like hurting or something like that.
Oh,
So you
Pasquale?
I think so.
Yeah, I like these kind. It's just, I don't know. Yeah, my ears hurt on some of them. Like, oh my God, they hurt. It makes me crazy.
Especially when we wear glasses.
Yeah, we had enough on us. Okay, there's a lot that I'm going to cover right now.
Is it blurry?
We talked about seam allowance. Everybody knows what seam allowance is. That's the distance between your stitching line and the edge of your fabric. But now we're going to talk about seam finishes, which means we have to address raveling.
Why is it so blurry?
Raveling is what happens to your fabric here, and then you're wearing it, and pretty soon you're a mess inside or you have nothing left. So we always address our raveling. The quickest, easiest way to address raveling after you've made your stitch, I've sewed these two pieces together, is just to hit the zigzag and go on the very edge. And it's a lot more on the edge than you think, just so that you can try to get some of the thread wrapped around that seam. So you just put it really close, almost to the point where the fabric is halfway on next to the needle. And you just hang on to that and zigzag right over it.
Yeah, I don't think it's really.
Oh, it's blurry.
Yeah.
What's going on?
It's like my eye vision.
Maybe wipe one. Oh. Oh.
Is that better? Sometimes it gets really close and it doesn't get blurry. Okay, that's probably the best we can do. Okay, yeah, you still can't see that well, but I'm looking at my fabric and that little square, that little opening in the foot, and it's halfway between. So that's what I'm using.
Is that why our clothing have the zigzag?
Yeah, the clothing that you were wearing is a overlock machine, and we have one of those in the other room. And I'll teach you how to use it. Overlock machine is what does this.
Oh, is that the one?
And what it does is while you're sewing, it trims edges of fabric off so that it wraps around. Overlock machine is also used for knitting knit fabric so that it will stretch. If you sew a knit fabric on a straight stitch machine and you pull your t-shirt on, your pop stitches. So the overlock has the stretch to it for knits, but it's also got a very tiny seam allowance.
So do you do this before you start sewing?
If you want to, yes. Like if I was making a pillow out of this, I would do all those first.
Okay.
Sometimes you make your seam first and then overlock. You just have to judge it as to what you're working on. So that's one way to finish a seam. The most common way. Who's that?
Daniel.
Somebody. Oh, Daniel. Just in time, Daniel. You missed the zigzag.
Hello, I'm back.
So this is a piece of sheer fabric, and it has overlock done on it. But I feel if this is a blouse or something that it's gonna show. I don't like the look of the overlock. So traditionally we would do a French seam, and what you see here is just a folded seam in itself. So that's called a French seam. That's the seam is overlocked. It's fine to do it that way. It's up to you. You're gonna make me little square samples of this, everybody, and you have a couple weeks to do them, but I want to see them sometime soon. You get points for it.
Having overlock and
you're gonna do all these 4 of them: the zigzag, the French, the flat felled, and the Hong Kong.
Okay.
This is a flat felled seam, as you can not see. I had a better one. A flat felled seam is the kind you would see on your jeans, your pants. It looks like that. It's sewn on the outside, and you just fold it over and sew on the fold. So I'll show you how to do that. It's called flat felled, 2 words. So that's flat felled seam, and then the last seam is called Hong Kong.
Is this recorded?
Hong Kong. Yeah, it's Hong Kong finish.
I looks recorded.
Can I record it? Is this recorded?
Yeah.
No.
I pushed record. I heard it.
Oh, it does. What are you talking about, Lucas? Hong Kong.
Yeah, I'm looking for my sample.
Why is
haven't
it called
heard
Hong
it.
Kong though?
I don't know,
Why is it
but
called
it's Hong
French
Kong
though?
like the city.
Come on.
French Hong
You get to
Kong.
go on a date.
French fries. So a Hong Kong seam finish is a straight seam that you've made, and then you're gonna cover each side of the seam with a piece of bias tape.
Why is it called Hong
And
Kong?
that's a ton of trouble to go through, but it looks really nice inside of a coat that's not lined. I have an unlined coat where I did this finish on it because it looks very nice. And like, think about when you take your jacket or inside a vest or something and you open your vest to get in the pocket, it shows. So this is a nice finish. Also, you see this inside sometimes wedding gowns. It's a couture thing where you're doing something really special. And I do like this one. It just takes a long time because you sew your seam, then you sew this on, and then you fold it over and sew it again. Same thing here, and you're just like, feels like an hour in one seam. So you have to really want to do it, which I did on my coat.
So
that's
this one
a
have
home-
have to have a really big seam allowance.
Have about 5/8 is good, but a 1/2 inch works as well, but nothing smaller. So here's the beginning of the Hong Kong seam finish. So I'll show you how to do it. So we sewed the seam, and you can see this is super bad raveling. So I've sewed the seam and I put this on, but I'm going to do the second side so you can see where we're at. You're not going to go anywhere except on that just small seam allowance. And you just put it flat, take a piece of bias tape, which you've already pre-cut, facing down so that the right sides are together. That's the right side of my seam allowance, and that's the right side of my bias tape. And I just do 1/4 inch, about right there. I just use the foot as a guide. In other words, I'm watching the edge of the foot as lining up with my fabric. And I've got to keep pushing this one out of the way. So it's starting to feel bulky. And then this foot is trying to push away from the lump. So you got to really hang on to it with your hands. It's going to take the upper hand, but you're taking the upper hand. Forcing this to stay in place so it doesn't dance around. You would just do that all the way down. And the next step is like what you did on the iPad welt pocket. You're going to stitch in the crack. Or sometimes people call it stitch in the ditch. I call it stitch in the crack. You can call it whatever you want. You probably could go to the iron, or you could just finger press it. So I want this nice and flat, not lumpy. And it's the reason we use bias is because it just curves around nice and stays really flat, as opposed to a straight piece of fabric. You definitely want to use bias. So now I'm going to just crack stitch. I don't want to top stitch right on top of my bias. I want to sew right next to it. So I'm going to put the needle so it just falls right next to that. Just be good at steering. Just keep checking your bias and pushing it under. I'm watching the needle go against the fold of the bias, not on it. Do that all the way down. So that's your Hong Kong seam. But the last thing we have to do, trying to cut it exact to size is too much of a nightmare for me. So I just do trim it afterwards. Once you've sewn on the bias, you can trim half of it away. And I'm leaving a little room after my stitching so that I have about 1/4 of an inch, or less than that, 1/8 of an inch. So I just trim that off. So now it's not going to interfere with my first seam. I'm going to press it open. That looks nice. I like those. I got a little bit off. What is it used for?
What do I need it?
I used it on a coat that I made because when you take off the coat, you want it to look nice. I didn't want overlock seams and probably didn't have the right color of overlock thread, but I just thought it would be fun to do them. So I did it on every seam of my coat, which took a long time, but I was, willing to do it. So the next thing is a French seam I'm going to show you. French seams are most often used on sheer fabric so that you can see, when you see through it, it looks nice. So I have the right sides together. It's hard to tell, but sometimes on fabric, it looks a little bit lighter on the wrong side than it does. So the print is a little bit more bright. So I'm going to take 1/4 inch here, and it's really flimsy at the top. So just be careful when you start. 1/4 inch is about right there. So make sure you hang onto this thread so that it doesn't shove in. I got it, it's moving. So I'm just going to match my seam allowance all the way down. Make sure it's straight. Okay, it's still matching. Sometimes here you can't see it. I can't, like, wow, it looks the same. And then you look at it and you didn't even catch it. This one is very much the same. Yeah, you backstitch. I didn't backstitch at the top. So now you got to trim this off a little bit because this is the right size, remember. We're looking at the right side and we have our seam on the right side. So now you're going to trim this down because it would be too big to cut it all, but it's too tiny to sew it at 1/8 of an inch, but I want to cut some of that off. These are the worst scissors ever.
You want ours?
Try the clips. Clips aren't really great for cutting fabric. As you can see, they'll take forever. But I just want to trim that seam down.
So that's kind of how you cheat.
Yes,
like
I
a
washed my
smaller
hair.
seam. It's like you have a longer seam allowance, but then you cut it after to look like it was really close.
To fit it in, but ultimately, this isn't this full seam allowance. This is only half the seam allowance because your seam allowance was a total of like either 1/2 inch or 5/8. So you're still not all the way there yet because you're going to fold this again and sew it. Then you will be at your correct seam allowance. So you want to make sure you are sewing ultimately to end up where your seam allowance needs to be. It's usually much faster when you go with regular scissors. I don't think my scissors at home are much better. One of these days I'm going to get new scissors.
You said you're gonna get them sharpened.
I know, I keep saying that, but then, I don't know, sometimes it feels like, I had my scissors sharpened one time and he ruined them, so.
Yeah. So have some more.
So at this point, you've got your wrong side. This is now my wrong side. This is still my right side. You could go to the iron and press that so that when you fold it, the edges of the thread is right on the edge of your fold. Yeah, get that iron going. So now I'm doing my real seam. Hang on to this guy.
So,
And I'm gonna back stitch. And then adjust while you go. I just got on the fabric and that's all I wanted to be. I even put this down so I can keep my track of my place. If you ironed it, you won't have to keep doing so much of this adjusting, but you want it to be super flat. Again, it's 1/4 of an inch. So by the time you're done sewing, you've all taken a total of about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If your fabric was if your seam allowance is like on a pattern, the patterns that you guys are making is 5/8 of an inch, then you're going to do the first stitching at 3/8 of an inch and the second one at 1/4. Total 5/8. And that's it. That's a French seam. So if you didn't trim enough off, you're going to have little hairs sticking out here. So you want to make sure you trimmed enough off. So that's an easy one.
so the seam is on the right side.
The seam's now on the wrong side because I started sewing it on the right side first, but then I enclosed what I sewed. So I started.
So this
with-
is right.
So this is
Okay.
right now. Yeah, but it doesn't matter on me.
Just
But
leave
you
it
know
as
when it would
that.
matter if you're doing
That
2
is that.
sleeves. You want to make sure because if you were doing this on 2 sleeves, you don't want to get it's the same fab. You know, there's no print. You can't tell the right side from the wrong side. You've got to mark your right sleeve and your left sleeve. Otherwise, you'll have 2 of the same sleeve. So be careful about that. So flat felled, which is this one, like our jeans. Same thing. We're going to sew it right sides together. I mean, right sides showing. And I do. You have to do at least 5/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch is kind of tight. So I'll do 5/8. 1/2 inch is just too small to get a good fold afterwards. There's 2 ways to do it. I do it offset, but that's kind of complicated and I don't want to complicate matters for you. So in the directions on if it's in a fabric, in a pattern, it's going to tell you to do it this way. So I'm 5/8 of an inch fully. Hang on the thread. And you just sew your seam all the way down. Obviously, you can't sew an entire pant leg. You can only do the outside. Like on jeans, it's only the outside. It's never the inside leg because you can't get inside. Because you have to be able to get inside. The second part of the seam. So now I need to trim part of this down because I'm gonna fold over. So if it's on pants, you want the fold to go toward the back. Now, bag, it really doesn't matter. I like to use this for tote bags too, because it has a nice finish inside. So I'm trimming off half of the seam allowance, which is about 1/4 inch. With this, the scissors don't mind this fabric, I guess. Again, go to the iron, press it so that this is flat. You can further press right now over with the iron. You're going to fold this little edge over what you cut away and sew it down. So you can further press that and pin it if you want. It depends on how the fabric's behaving or how you want to, deal with it. Sometimes it's fine to deal with it, sometimes it's too hard. So spreading it again, tucking it under, and then just flatten it. And I'm sewing very close to the folded edge so that I have a nice, straight seam. This is an extra sturdy seam, and it also adds a little bit of structure, especially to a bag. It makes it a little stronger on the side, so it maybe stands up nicer. Maybe. Just keep going a little bit at a time. There's no speed that you have to meet unless you have a deadline. I find that while I sew, I take things slow and methodical when I'm sewing. When I have a deadline is when I really go crazy and blow through it, and it comes out the same, but I feel sometimes I just take longer than I should, but I like it, and it's kind of like I've got your earbuds on. I'm currently obsessed with Whitney Houston. Yeah. And there's a flat felt seam. So on the inside, if it was a tote bag, it looks nice. Some fabric is too thick to do this with, but I think this is a good weight fabric, and that looks like a good seam. So you're going to do, these are your assignment: a flat felt seam, the stitch and zigzag. It just can be a little short one, a French seam, and the Hong Kong seam.
And we can do it just like this.
You can do little samples and then just take pictures of it, because that becomes a process.